Hello, everyone. It's Doug Woodward. We're set now for another episode of The Hot Seat, and I have to tell you, I'm very excited about this because today I get to interview the best interviewer in evangelical television radio. So the table is turned, and I get to ask him tough questions, and we'll see how he handles the heat on the hot seat. And so anyway, it'll be a great time. So let me introduce you to Derek Gilbert. Derek, we all know because we see him a lot since he's the host of Skywatch TV News. He's been for years doing View from the Bunker. He's married to someone even smarter than him, in Sharon, right. Gilbert, right? And together they've written books, and then separately they've written books. And so we're going to pick up on one of his books today. It's called Giants, Gods, and Dragons. And we're going to talk about that. But let me start off by just asking Derek this question. Derek, you are fascinated by the ancient gods of, we call it paganism, of Sumer, of Akkadia, and other folks, Babylon and so on. What got you so interested in this arcane and ancient information?
The Bible. Sharon and I started back in 2014 with a weekly Bible study that grew out of requests that we were getting at conferences from people who said, we can't find a church in our area that teaches on the Bible. Do you know of one? And because we're not familiar with the whole country, and we tend to be a little different in the way we approach our understanding of the Bible than most pastors, which is not a slam at pastors. It's, what they're taught in seminary. We really couldn't make a recommendation. So Sharon, who comes up with all of the good ideas that come out of our house, said, why don't we start a podcast and go verse by verse through the Bible? And let's do it in chronological order. There are some reading plans out there. Read the Bible in a year, but do it in chronological order, meaning that you follow the verses as they occurred in history. So you do the first 10 chapters of Genesis, and then you skip to Job, and then back to Genesis, and when you pick up the story of Abraham and so on. And that leads to some really interesting things when you get to the life of David, and you skip back and forth between the historical narrative of David's life and the Psalms. Because then some of the Psalms suddenly make more sense when you realize what David was going through when he wrote certain Psalms. But anyway, we got to Exodus chapter 14, and we read the first verses of Exodus 14, and I'll paraphrase because I don't have it open in front of me, but basically said that God told Moses, turn back and camp in front of this place called Pihahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon. And it's like, wait a minute, turn back. Does this really mean as the Israelites are escaping Egypt after all the plagues and let my people go, and the deaths of the firstborn, and the Israelites are running away, and then God says, turn around? Is that really what that means? And yes, that's what that means. So I was like, okay, was that always in there? Because I don't remember that from the movie. Which sadly is where I got a lot of my theology before we started really digging into the scripture through our weekly Bible.
And everyone else, right?
Right. And then the next question is, what is Baal Zephon? I mean, I'm no scholar, but I know enough to know that Baal was not an Egyptian god. What little I've read about the plagues of Egypt was that they corresponded to the gods of Egypt. And here we've got God telling Moses to turn around and camp in front of a place that's sacred to Baal. So I started digging into history and found that archaeologists and historians know about this period of Egyptian history. It's called the Second Intermediate Period, sometime roughly between 1750 and about 1550 BC or thereabouts, where a group of people called the Hyksos, which is transliterated from Egyptian words that means rulers of foreign lands. Well, it turns out that they were Amorites. Some of the people that Joshua and the Israelites had to push out of Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, well, who are the Amorites? Well, the Amorites were just a name given to a large group of tribal people who pretty much dominated the lands of the Bible as we know them for a period of about 500 years, from the time of Abraham around 2000 BC, give or take, down to about 1500 BC, give or take. Everything in what we now know as Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, northern Egypt, southern Turkey, western Iran, all of that was under the control of various tribes that were of Amorite derivation was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Right. That's all right.
So it was really an age of Amorites, and their religion was well described in the Bible. The chief god of their pantheon was Baal.
Yeah, you didn't expect to discover Baal in Egypt, right?
No, no. And as it turns out, and since that really started things going about 5 years ago, and began to read up on the Amorites and the other ites that are from the area, the Hittites, the Hurrians, the Akkadians and the Sumerians and so forth.
The stalactites and the stalagmites.
Right. And we find out that there was a lot more cross-pollination between these groups of people than we realized. And in fact, the best dates for the Exodus, about 1446 BC, with the entry into Canaan at about 1406 BC, that means Ramses the Great, Ramses the Second, or Yul Brynner, if you're like me and remember the movie. He reigned about 2 centuries after the Exodus. So he was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Right.
But he erected a stela, that's a commemorative stone, dedicated to his father, Seti the First, and depicts Seti the First bringing a gift of wine to the god Baal.
Wow.
So he was still
I hadn't read that before. Yeah.
It's called the 400-year stela, and you can find depictions on it. What's interesting about it is that the Amorites, and then after they left, the Egyptians afterward, who continued to venerate Baal in northern Egypt, equated Baal with Set.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Most of what we know about Set, that we think Set was the evil guy who chopped Osiris into 14 pieces.
Correct.
That was 1,000 years later.
Okay.
Set was a good guy in the pantheon originally.
I was going to say I can tell first off that we're not going to have any trouble getting you to talk. All right. And then, and then second, I will throw out to the audience, you and I have some differences of opinion on chronology, just because I have studied it just intensely and have kind of hung things on certain hooks and certain dates. We'll cover some of that today. But I placed the Exodus actually early myself and a few secular scholars, and because it corresponds to archaeology that was done regarding the time that Jericho and Ai and so forth were burned. But we'll get to that later. You're talking about chronology, but one of the things that struck me, which is interesting to me, is that you bring up and talk about chaos and conf, like Mein Kampf is what it sounds like. Tell us about that, and because this kind of goes back really possibly well before Adam and Eve. Can you talk about that?
Well, this is one of the reasons that Sharon and I decided to call the book Giants, Gods, and Dragons. It actually started with the guys who played Dungeons and Dragons. Last year, there was a story out that they were protesting the makers of the game because the orcs in the game were always depicted as evil. It's the orcs were the really nasty, vicious, man-eating villains,
or creatures of the Hobbit or of the two Towers or whatever they were.
Well, basically the world of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Right, exactly.
And if you read some backstory on it, you realize they're evil because they were elves who'd been twisted by the dark god Morgoth, and they are inherently evil. That's just what they are. They're like
messed with their DNA, right?
Yeah. They're demons. Sorry, I got a fly in the room here. We had a door open for a long time yesterday, and to move some furniture into the studio here.
Hopefully, it won't do to you what it did to Obama. Right. but I digress.
Yeah.
So anyway, Chaos back to him.
Yeah. So anyway, it occurred to me that while we can laugh at these guys who were protesting these fictional characters as though they were real, we American Christians tend to take the real historic characters of the Bible and treat them as though they're fiction. Survey after survey shows that most of American Christians, about 60%, don't believe that Satan is real. Don't really believe in demons, much less the dragons that are described in Scripture, like Satan, of course, described as a 7-headed red dragon in Revelation. But there's another dragon that features prominently in the Old Testament, if you look, and that is Chaos, or Leviathan, which represents primordial chaos. This was a symbol that was common in the ancient world, the ancient Near East, had a common myth of a warrior god who had to subdue or defeat chaos in order to bring, order to the natural world so that humanity could live in an ordered universe.
This is the creation myth. People's possibly living before Adam, but even early, if they were post Adam and Eve, relatively early, they did not decide to read Genesis 1 because it hadn't been written yet, and
Yes.
so they had to make up their own creation myth.
Yes. But we see this in Genesis 1, verse 2. It's reflected where we read, the earth was without form and void, or the earth was made formless and void, or the earth became without form and void, depending on how you choose to translate it.
Tohu bohu.
Yes.
Yes.
And darkness was over the face of the deep. Well, the word translated deep is tehom, which is a Hebrew equivalent of an Akkadian word temtum, which in turn is a cognate, meaning same word, different language, for Tiamat, which is the Sumerian name for this chaos dragon or chaos monster that in the Bible is called Leviathan. So we see in Genesis 1, verse 2, where God has already subdued Tehom, Tiamat, Leviathan. There are other depictions of it in the Bible, Isaiah 47, where Isaiah prophesies on that day, which is the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord, finally destroying Leviathan. But we see other references to it in the Psalms, Job 41 in particular, where there's a long description of Leviathan, which if you ever want to get a kid interested in the Bible, just have them read Job 41, because although Bible commentators will say, oh, that's a crocodile, any kid reading that will say, no, it ain't. That's a dragon. And
Which
that's
one
exactly
was supposed to be the hippo?
That would be Behemoth.
Yeah, Behemoth, the hippo with the giant tail, and of course, hippo never have never had giant tails.
Exactly. So this struggle against chaos is a very old struggle, and we argued in the book that not only is it the first enemy of God mentioned in Scripture, it's the last one to be defeated. We see that in Revelation chapter 21, when there's a new heaven and a new earth, and then John adds, and the sea is no more. Well, the key to understanding that is that the sea, especially in the Old Testament, is representative of primordial chaos. In fact, the Hebrew word for sea, yam, is the Canaanite name for Leviathan.
Right.
This primordial chaos monster.
It's incredible in a way. There's a couple of things. Certainly, the thing that comes to mind is how consistent some of these pagan myths really were throughout the world. And you continue to see that all the way down to the Greek and Roman gods, as you point out, because they really are sort of just transliterated from previous gods that may have lived 1,000 years before or 2,000 years before. And so it's pretty clear to see, how you could get interested in this once you learn about these things. Now, you're clearly an old earther like myself. So do you catch any flack for any comments that you might make on that subject?
Occasionally, but and we don't want to disfellowship with anybody, but we make clear that when we put dates in our books, we tend to use the dates that are generally accepted by archaeologists, just because we don't want to cut them out of this information on the basis of their preconceptions of how old the earth is.
Yes.
So when we talk about something like Göbekli Tepe and we say, well, they date that to 9,000 BC. Yes, we're aware that Bishop Ussher put the date of the earth at 4,004 BC, and that there are other dates that come out of the Septuagint translation that are not quite that old. But we're using those dates just because we'd like this to preach outside the choir.
Right.
We're still open, though, to some other ideas. There's a fellow named Dr. Barry Setterfield who I've had the chance to talk with, and I haven't got my head around his research, but it's fascinating to me. He explains it, and I'm going to mangle it, but this is how much of it I understand, is that when God stretched out the heavens, like stretching out a balloon or a piece of rubber, you're putting energy into that fabric, that material, and then as it contracts again, energy escapes from it as it goes back to its original place. That is the premise upon which he puts forward a theory that at its very basic is this, that there is not necessarily the same correlation today between actual time and solar time. In other words, how we experience time today relative to the movement of the earth around the sun may not be the same as it was 5,000 orbits around the sun ago.
That's true. Yes.
In other words, one orbit around the sun, they may have been experiencing time faster. So that Methuselah was really 969 years old, even if the earth didn't go around the sun 969 times in that period of
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I understand it. And
Yeah.
I'm open to that, because you look at some weird things like the amount of the rate of decay of carbon-14 and the amount of solar radiation, where it's not a constant. The speed of light is not a constant. It's changing. It's actually slowing down. So it's a lot of weird stuff out
Yeah,
there.
well,
That,
I'll just add to that Setterfield's really the guy that got me interested in looking at the Septuagint and the chronology. Now, he's a young earther in that sense, because he
Mhm.
reinterprets from a scientific standpoint how we can understand the a young Earth. All right, but at the same time, he actually emphasizes a lot in his writings the chronology of the Septuagint. And
Mhm.
so, like myself, he sort of adds another 1,500 years to the narrative of Genesis, and basically says that, as I say, that the rabbis in 100 AD, they remanufactured portions of the Old Testament, predominantly the messianic prophecies, but also Genesis 5 and 11. And
Mhm.
so he got me started on that. I hope someday to have a chance to visit with him. So yeah, feel free to give me an introduction. But he's really the guy I have to blame for getting me into the Septuagint and all that. So now I'm a little different than you, because I want to do the same reconciliation with secular archaeology and secular science, but I do it by taking the Septuagint chronology as a given, and then hanging the events. But then I also basically say, all right, before the Adam and Eve, I believe there was a time of desolation that may have stretched from roughly 9,500 BC to basically 6,000 BC. And it was, the earth was covered with water, and there was a flood, and then it was the Spirit of God that was hovering over those waters. But before that, 10,000 BC beyond, kind of like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval and others, that there was a pre-Adamic civilization. And so
Mhm.
I think you probably share the same idea. I've been foolish enough, though, to try to put all that together. That's sort of the last chapter of Rebooting the Bible, Part 2. So we share the same desire to
Mhm.
uh, make ourselves fit into sort of the science of today without really compromising our theology. But
Right.
nevertheless, that's an important thing. So, all right, let's jump subjects. Enough about that. Let's talk about the Mount of Assembly. And you got that fly. So if we ever
Yeah.
need to take a break here and kill a fly, feel free to let me know. So let's talk about the Mount of Assembly. You make but I'm saying you, of course, it's really you and Sharon, but what I'll
Mhm.
just say you today, since you're a singular right there, not counting the Holy Spirit that's right beside you. But nevertheless, the Mount of Assembly, that's an important concept for you. Now, I have this suspicion that you picked up this from Michael Heiser. Is that probably true,
Well,
or is
it
that
is.
something you already figured out by yourself?
Well, no, it is, and I followed. I followed some of the original research that he cited, like Charles Torrey who wrote in the Harvard Theological Review back in, I believe it was around 1930, the
Mm,
article that really gave us the foundation, I guess, for the understanding of the Har Moed, the Mount of Assembly, or the Mount of the Congregation in some English translations, and why it's so important. It's mentioned in Isaiah 14, where the rebel from Eden, Halel ben Shachar, or Lightbringer, son of Dawn, is cast out of Eden, and he wants to establish his Mount of Assembly or Mount of Congregation in the uttermost heights of the north. And people had just kind of passed over that. Okay, well, that's fine. The Mount of
Kind of like
Assembly, the
the
far reaches of the north.
Lord of hosts. We hear that 120 times in the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's God in the stars.
Yeah. No, what it really means is Yahweh of armies is that's his title. Yahweh of armies.
Yeah, not stars.
Yeah.
Right.
But Torrey took that a step further, and he said, okay, this is really important in Isaiah 14 because it identifies this Har Moed, this Mount of Assembly, as a place where the gods would assemble and congregate. Um, and that concept was well known in Mesopotamia. There was a place where the divine council or the divine assembly in Mesopotamia would meet. It was at the city of Nippur under the headship of the chief god of Mesopotamia called Enlil. And
Mm.
this is where the Sitchonites, Zechariah Sitchin and his followers, got the idea that Nibiru, which is just another way of transliterating Nippur, was actually the home planet of the Anunnaki because, the gods of Sumer were actually ancient aliens. No,
I'm hearing the music from the
misunderstood.
Twilight Zone play in the background.
Right. Yeah. They misunderstood. The point is that this was a concept that was well known in Mesopotamia. So this was not invented by the Hebrews. The idea that there was a place where the gods would assemble as a council under the headship of a chief deity.
Mm.
Well, John in Revelation chapter 19, as he's talking about, or is it 16 where he references Armageddon? Anyway, it was assumed by English speakers who were trying to reverse engineer the Hebrew from the Greek of the New Testament, assumed that Har Megiddon in the Greek must come from Armageddon in the Greek must be Har Megiddon in Hebrew, meaning the Mount of Megiddo, which is where we get this idea that Megiddo is where the final battle of the ages will be fought.
In the north.
Yeah, yeah.
Not far from Galilee, or actually right adjacent to Galilee.
Yeah, but 50 miles from Jerusalem, where all of the Old Testament apocalyptic prophecies put the final battle.
Yeah.
So
interesting, huh?
Yeah. So John said what John was doing actually was trying to find a way to, and this is what Tori pointed out. He was trying to find a way to write in Greek the Hebrew Har Moed. And the difficulty is that between the Mo and the Aid is a character called the Ayin, which looks like a reverse apostrophe. And there is no corresponding sound or character in either Greek or English for the Ayin. It's a glottal stop, Moed. So the closest thing to it was a gamma. But English speakers, assuming, seeing the gamma in Greek, think, okay, that must be a gimel in Hebrew. So Har Moed becomes Har Megiddon. And that's where we get the idea it's Megiddo. Tori's contribution to scholarship and our understanding of end times prophecy is saying, no, that concept that Har Moed is God's holy mountain, which if you read the Bible in context, it's Zion, which is in Jerusalem. It's the Temple Mount. It's where the temple is located. It's where Abraham was tested rather.
Right.
And that's what this is all about. It's all about the war for the Mount of Assembly. And in fact, my forthcoming book, The Second Coming of Saturn, I'm going to argue even further that this is the reason that the old entity called El by the Canaanites, or Molech, one and the same, I'm going to argue, tempted or lured Solomon through one of his wives into building the high place for Milcom, Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the Mount of Olives, because the Mount of Olives is 200 feet higher. It's actually taller than the Temple Mount. So this old rebellious entity, a fallen angel, if you will, convinced King Solomon, who built the temple, to build a high place for him looking down on the temple
of Yahweh.
So it's all about the struggle for the Har Moed, Armageddon.
All of a sudden, that's perfect. And when you think in terms of the, I think it's in Zechariah, but it may be in one of the minor prophets, we learn that Christ returns and he touches down on the Mount of Olives.
Exactly. Zechariah 14.
Olives, Zechariah 14. And the mountain splits and so forth. Yep. But if, to your point, if the battle is in, the Valley of Megiddo, 50 miles to the north, why does he come back to the Mount of Olives? Is he scared to come into the battle, or just
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. No, it's all about Jerusalem. The battle is there because it's all about who controls that Mount of Assembly.
Okay, now talk about the Zaphon and talk about Mount Hermon, because they are also mounts of assembly, and you have some interesting points to share with us about those.
Well, in fact, that was what led to my first book, as I realized the importance of mountains and sacred mountains in all throughout history. In fact, Babel was just an artificial mountain. Ziggurats and step pyramids all over the world are just humanity's attempt to create an artificial mountain to create a point of contact with the gods, the spirit realm. Mount Zaphon is important because that was known as the Mount of Assembly of the god Baal. That's where everyone in the ancient world knew Baal's palace was located on Mount Zaphon. Today, it's called Jebel al-Akra. It's in Turkey, but it's just across the border from Syria.
Right.
Yeah, right on the Mediterranean Sea. It's about 5,200. It's about a mile high. Very imposing mountain right on the Mediterranean coast. But interestingly, it was also the mountain sacred to and Baal being the storm god. Okay, this is the key to understanding his many manifestations in other cultures.
Right.
This mountain was also sacred to the the Hurrian storm god Teshub, the Hittite storm god called Tarhuns. It was also where the Greek storm god Zeus defeated the chaos monster called Typhon.
Mm.
It was believed that the channel of the Orontes River in Syria was created when Typhon dove under the mountain to get away from Zeus's lightning bolts. So this was a very important mountain for all for the storm god. And interestingly, it isn't that far away at Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, where the temple of Jupiter was created on top of an older temple to Baal. It was the largest temple to Jupiter in the entire Roman Empire.
Yeah, you make a point later in the book, which I hadn't thought about asking you or making this point, that the scholars of today haven't made much of Mesopotamia in terms of influencing Roman and Greek culture and so forth.
Right.
But that's changing, isn't it?
It is. Just the last 50 years or so, there was a very influential book by Martin West called The East Face of Helicon. But prior to that, 1965, a scholar from who was at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, Michael Astor, wrote a book called Helena. Yes, one of the Seleukids.
Yes.
He wrote a book called Helleno-Semitica, which kind of covered the same territory and showed how so much of what we read in the Greek and Roman corpus of their religious texts,
their pantheon,
has parallels in the older Semitic religious texts.
Yes.
But it was, and this has been really changing over the last century or so. Up until about 50, 60 years ago, it was believed that what we know of the Greek and Roman gods grew out of an older Proto-Indo-European religion, but that really is no longer the case. It's still sort of assumed, I think, by a lot of people who haven't really read much about this. But when you start looking at the correlations between Greek and Roman religion and what the Hurrians and the Hittites knew, and you see that this was only discovered like in the 1940s, the texts from the old Hittite capital of Hattusha with with that preserved older Hurrian texts going back to the middle of the 4th millennium BC about the god Kumarbi. And they found the parallels between the story of this god Kumarbi and the story of Kronos, Saturn to the Romans, and how he overthrew the sky god, and then in turn was overthrown by his son, the storm god. It's like, wait a minute now, that doesn't that really, but this guy Kumarbi is also very much like this older entity Enlil from Mesopotamia, who in turn
exactly
replaced the sky god and was replaced by a storm god Marduk. So yeah, scholars have really changed their opinion on that, and the influence of Mesopotamia and the Semitic cultures on the Aegean world, the Greeks, and then later the Romans, really has changed. In fact, there's a lot more. In fact, my forthcoming book, The Second Coming of Saturn, I dive into that just a little bit, just to show how this information, these beliefs, moved from east to west. Many of the people groups named in Genesis and Deuteronomy that had to be pushed out by Joshua and the Israelites, the Perizzites and the Girgashites and the Hivites, are actually Greek. I mean, the Perizzites is just a different way of translating Pelashet, which are the Philistines. The Girgashites, they come from a community, Girgas, which was between Troy and Miletus on the west coast of what is now Turkey. And the Hivites was just a different way of transliterating the Ahiyawa, which is a Luwian word for the Greeks who fought against Troy.
You've got a convincing argument there. I'd say that things are changing. Now that brings us to what is probably one of the significant changes in prophetic thought, which also is a Mount of Assembly, Mount Hermon. It has had a huge impact upon the community of prophetic studiers and writers like ourselves. Speak to Mount Hermon as a Mount of Assembly.
Well, this was the abode of El. A scholar by the name of Edward Lipinski about 40 years ago wrote a paper called El's Abode. And interestingly, he pointed out 2 locations of El's abode. One of them was actually the mountains of Armenia, which is significant because that's where Ararat is located. But the other one that he called the Semitic Olympus was Mount Hermon. And that's significant because then it makes it easier for us to understand as we read the Bible why Jesus chose Caesarea Philippi at the foot of Mount Hermon to reveal his divinity when he asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" And then he climbed a very high mountain shortly thereafter, which can only be Mount Hermon because it's the only one in the vicinity,
Not Mount Tabor.
No, not Mount Tabor, as the tradition holds, but no, Mount Hermon, where he was transfigured into a being of light. So it's very significant. And the more you read into the texts, and especially the Canaanite texts from Ugarit, which is an Amorite kingdom on the Syrian coast of the Mediterranean, destroyed around the time of the Judges, about 1200 BC. It's clear that that area between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee was very important for a number of reasons. First, because that mountain, Hermon, was known to be a place of special religious significance. In fact, it's even referenced in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu are trying to make a name for themselves by killing the monster Humbaba or Huwawa.
Right.
And they penetrate the forests of Lebanon on the mountain there, and the secret dwelling or the secret abode of the Anunnaki is supposed to be there, which is interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it was Doug Hamp who talked a bit about the fact that there has recently been a stela that has been found either at I think it was up on Mount Hermon.
Well, yeah, actually, this was found.
Talk about that. Yeah, talk about that.
Actually, this was found in 1869.
Okay.
But credit where it's due. Doug Hamp, in his new book, Corrupting the Image 2, has found information in this text that has eluded scholars for 100 years.
Right.
This text was found by Sir Charles Warren. Sharon found out about this when she was researching her series of novels called The Red Wing Saga, which opens with the investigation of the Jack the Ripper killings.
Yeah, fascinating point that you make.
Yeah. Well, it turns out the superintendent of Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, at the time of the Ripper murders was Sir Charles Warren in 1888. But 19 years earlier, 1869, he was an engineer, and he was sent out by the Palestine Exploration Fund to survey the land of then Palestine, because the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and there was some archaeological interest in it, but the United Kingdom wanted to see what might be there for the taking, if and when
a land grab. Basically.
Yeah. So it was intelligence gathering.
Right.
He climbed Mount Hermon in September of 1869, and inside the temple on the summit called Qasr Antar, folks had known that it was there, but for some reason, somehow, for more than 2,000 years, a stela inside that temple had been overlooked. It was 4 foot high, 18 inches wide, about 12 inches deep, and inscribed on this stela in very archaic Greek, the words that until Doug came along had been translated, "By order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here." Now, scholars, especially scholars of Enochic literature, meaning the Book of Enoch, agree that this is a reference to the Watchers, or the sons of God mentioned in Genesis chapter 6.
Yes.
The Book of Enoch describes how they descended to the summit of Mount Hermon and made a mutual pact, or swore an oath with one another, with the leader, the chief Shemiyaza, who I, in my forthcoming book, am going to argue that Shemiyaza is Saturn, Kronos, Baal, Haman, etc.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
That they agreed to do this deed to take wives of human women, produce children, and also teach humanity things we weren't supposed to know. What Doug found, and by the way, this stela is now in the British Museum, although it's not on display. We checked while we were there summer before last.
Okay, it's not.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's hidden somewhere. It has been on display in the past, but it's not now.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Doug found that there were some characters on this stela that were kind of overlooked by scholars who didn't know what to make of them, so they just sort of glossed over it.
Right.
And his new translation adds there was I think it's Bo Batios, where the words that were missed.
That sounds right.
And Bo is a Greek prefix that means bull-like or bovid. And Batios, that took some work, and again, Doug was brilliant in ciphering this out. The first 3 letters, B-A-T, bot or bod, was a transliterated Sumerian term that means the god Enlil or Dagon, because Enlil, Dagon, El, Kronos, Saturn, Baal Haman, all the same entity under different names.
Yes. Yeah,
And
I'll make a quick
and
comment for those of you that may not know it. I interviewed Doug Hamp on a hot seat, and we went into this in depth. And so it's out there. If you
well
want
worth
to
it.
look that up, it's a great discussion.
Well worth it. So
Yeah.
the only in my forthcoming book, I cite Doug's book because I think this is brilliant, and it helped cement my case that this entity was all one and the same, and that Mount Hermon was very important to this entity. But the reference to the bull-like or bovid, in my view, is a reference to the main epithet of the god El, the Canaanite creator god, or the Canaanite version of this god. He was called in those texts from you, Garrett, Bull El.
Right.
So I would argue that the text ought to be translated by order of the Most High and Holy Bull El. Those who swore an oath proceed from here. And of course, that also helps reinforce my claim that El, Dagon, Enlil, Kronos, Saturn, etc., is Shemiyaza, the Watcher Chief who led this rebellion on Mount Hermon.
And then what's of course fascinating about that is that Bull El sounds a lot like the bulls of Bashan of Psalm 22 and other places, right?
Exactly right. Yes, as a scholar by the name of Charles Miller, as I recall, he's at the Catholic University in Washington D.C. It's Robert Miller. I'm sorry, Robert Miller II.
That's all right.
Wrote a paper on this and basically argued what he called it, the Baals of Bashan, and brilliant line that I have to give him credit for. The bulls of Bashan in Psalm 22 are divine, not bovine.
Ah. I love that. Nice turn of a phrase there.
Yes. Contrary to what a lot of biblical, you can read this in biblical commentaries because there are mentions of Bashan often in the Old Testament,
right.
And often in contexts like this, like the fat cows of Bashan or the fat beasts of Bashan or the bulls of Bashan. Oh, Bashan was a great area for raising cattle. No, it's not. It's essentially a bunch of granite or basalt expelled from a volcano thousands of years ago. It's a lousy place to raise cattle.
Just to expand on that, it makes more sense because if I'm not mistaken, it's Psalm 22 that talks about the bulls of Bashan that are there that are mocking Christ. And if they're actually gods, they're mocking Christ. That really adds some intensity to that phrase, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and it helps to make sense of Psalm 68 too, where you see, many peak mountain, mountain of God. Actually, it's Har Elohim, mountain of the gods, a mountain of Bashan, a many peak mountain, mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with envy at the mountain that God has chosen for his own? I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, Psalm 68 describes a supernatural war at Mount Hermon.
Yes,
where God leads captives away in his train. In fact, it's a verse that Paul quotes in the letter to the Ephesians.
Right. Well, all this points out that the interest that you and Sharon have in understanding the names of the gods, the pantheons of these various peoples, it amplifies so much in the history of the Old Testament. And let me ask this question. One of the things that could come up is saying, well, gosh, these are, the scripture is a revealed truth of God. Why would there be references to pagan gods? Do we need that? Does that really add to, the revealed truth of the scripture? What might you say to that?
Well, yeah, it's that the prophets and the apostles understood what their neighbors believed. They read the writings of the pagans and they understood the belief systems of the pagans, and much of what's in the Bible is directed at them either as polemic or as persuasion to try to win over, especially in the New Testament, to win over people who have been following other gods, other belief systems. In the Old Testament, it's mainly warnings against the Jews. Don't follow these other gods. We see in Deuteronomy 4, verse 19, a warning given by God to Moses. Tell the Israelites, don't bow down and worship the sun and the moon and all the host of heaven. The army of heaven,
right?
Things that God allotted to the nations for their inheritance. God allotted these fallen angels to the nations as the pagan gods.
Well, it was kind of a negative reward for their following sin.
It was. And in Psalm 82, you have a courtroom scene in the heavenly realm where God takes his place in the divine council and basically says, because you ruled unjustly, though you are gods, all of you sons of the Most High, like men you shall die and fall like any prince.
Right,
so
right.
they were basically acknowledging the reality of the world in which they lived. They couldn't pretend that these things didn't exist because all of their neighbors knew that. Well, they knew they did.
No, the
And certainly
example,
their neighbors did too.
absolutely. The example I like to use, because I'm familiar with this from a philosophy standpoint, an old philosophy major, is the Logos of John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And of course, what John was, he was responding to a philosopher named Philo, who lived in Alexandria, contemporary with Christ. And Philo had developed an extensive concept of the Logos, but the Logos for Philo was a emanation. He was, in effect, an intermediary that wasn't fully divine. And that's why John said in the Logos was with God, but the Logos was God. That's his point. And of course, Paul says a similar thing in Colossians. So yeah, so there is, it's kind of like context is everything.
Well, yeah, and the early church understood this too. When you read the writings of the early church fathers, when they touch on the subject of demons or the gods of the pagans, they understand that these gods of the pagans were fallen angels, and that demons are the spirits of the giants, the Nephilim, who were destroyed in the flood of Noah. It's just taken as assumed. We know this.
Yes.
And so it wasn't until around the time of Augustine in the 5th century, Augustine popularized a theory that had put out by Julius Africanus about 100 years earlier, that the sons of God from Genesis 6 were actually the righteous sons of Seth, who were corrupted by the evil daughters of Cain.
Yes.
And that is the default belief to this day in seminary. So, pastors, when they are going to seminary today, that's what they come out believing. And you try to explain, well, no, these sons of God are actually spirit beings, angels, if you will, who decided to exercise the free will that God created them with, just like he created us with free will. Frankly, I don't understand why it's that difficult to accept. If a pastor is willing to accept that Satan is a literal entity, and Jesus in Matthew 12, verses 22 through 26, equated Satan with Baal.
Right.
Understand, Beelzebul means Baal the prince. Right. And in the letter to the church at Pergamum in Revelation 2, where he says, I know where you live, where Satan dwells, a reference to the great altar of Zeus, the Greek version of Baal.
Right.
Okay, Satan exists. Jesus equates him with Baal or with Zeus. So then if Zeus exists, then what about Apollo or Hermes or Ares? Or what about these others? Why couldn't they be? Yeah.
Let me jump into, I wanted to read a couple of quotes from your book and then have you comment on them, because there's some clarity that I'd like to get in terms of your thinking on this, that this follows along the issue of titans and spirits and the Nephilim and the difference between the angels and the spirits and so forth. You make this statement, you and Sharon: could the Antichrist actually be the spirit of chaos, also known as Leviathan, Tiamat, Timtu, and the dragon? Are these titans in the abyss, but do their spirits still dwell on the earth? What might be the relationship of the Nephilim, their spirits, and biblical entities? And then another quote: Titans, Watchers, Anunnaki, and even Apkallu angrily roar out of the abyss. That's where they are now, the abyss, but they'll soon be given a short time to torment humanity. 5 months, 150 days, the same time you missed a word there, by the way. I do that too. I still find typos in my books. Yuck. The same time it took for their children, the Nephilim, to die in the flood, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days, which is Genesis 7:24. Okay, so you got all this morass of spirits and entities and titans and Rephaim and the Nephilim and all that. And I think you're trying to provide some kind of a synthesis or a clarification. And I'll ask you to try to do that for us right now.
Okay. It is our belief that the watchers of the book of Enoch, the sons of God of Genesis 6, they are the same entities that the Greeks called the Titans. They would be equated with the Apkallu of ancient Mesopotamia. The Apkallu were considered to be supernatural sages who brought the gifts of civilization from the god Enki, whose temple was called the Abzu, the house of the abyss, and which is where they dwell. They came from the Abzu, the abyss, and brought these gifts to humanity. According to Mesopotamian text, the god Marduk, I think the text is the Epic of Era, Era. remembered a time when he lost his temper and banished the Apkallu to the abyss and told them never to return. Well, in 2 Peter 2, verse 4, we read that for God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. Well, the word in hell, the word translated hell, rather, in English is in Greek, tartarosos, which is the only place in the New Testament that's used, which means it's weird, which, as our friend Mike Heiser says, if it's weird, it's important when it comes to the Bible.
Right.
It literally means thrust down to Tartarus. Now, Tartarus is not the same place as Hades. Those were different places in the Greek mind. Peter wrote this knowing this, and he wrote under the influence of the Holy Spirit, so he chose that word deliberately. Tartarus was believed to be as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. It was a place reserved for supernatural threats to the divine order. It's not where the run-of-the-mill dead went. It was where the angels who sinned were confined. This is similar to the descriptions that we see of the sinning angels in the book of Enoch, around First Enoch, I think chapter 18 through 21 in there. Enoch is taken on a tour of the underworld by Gabriel, or Uriel rather, and shown these burning mountains. And well, these are the angels who consorted with women, and these are the angels who didn't come out at their appointed times, and what have you.
Right.
Those would be equated to the Titans of Greek mythology, even though the Greek story of the Titans doesn't have them fooling around with human women. Those are the only supernatural entities that we know of that are located in the abyss. And so when Revelation 9, the abyss, the bottomless pit, opens up, it's a reasonable assumption, I think, or a reasonable guess, if not a theory,
Right.
that these are the entities that will emerge from the abyss. Now, they don't sound like the Greek description of the Titans. They come out, they look like locusts, and they are horrifying and terrible, and they've got the power of scorpions in their tails, and they torment humanity, all without the seal of God on their forehead for 5 months. But the 5-month period intrigued me, because that's not a period of time that you see often. It's not used symbolically in the Bible. It's not like 40 days or 40 years or 70 but then I remembered the 150 days that the ark was on the water back in the book of Genesis 7, Genesis 8, 150 days before the ark came to land and landed in the mountains of Ararat. Now, it was some time after that they finally got off the ark, but that's the period of time that the ark was actually floating on the water. The period of time when those entities, now confined to the abyss, were compelled to watch as their children were destroyed in the flood that God sent to cleanse the earth. I think it's not a coincidence that you got this bookending of the 5 months, the 150 days, because you're dealing with a 30-day lunar month in the Hebrew calendar. It's the same exact time period. I think that's what we're looking at that comes out at the end.
That's pretty educated speculation, and the emphasis is on educated. So well done. Well done.
You're very gracious. But the depiction of the entities in Revelation 9, these things that fly out of the abyss, is similar to the Mesopotamian concept of the Apkallu in this regard. They are human-animal hybrids, or theriomorphic, the word scholars would use.
It says they have faces, doesn't it?
Right. And in that regard, the Apkallu of Mesopotamia, there were 3 forms. One was a bearded man with wings. So again, human-animal hybrid. One was a hawk-headed biped with wings. And then there was the fish-cloaked man. It was been incorrectly identified as the god Dagon, or a priest of Dagon, for ever since Alexander Hislop in 1860. But he was one of the Apkallu, one of these sages who emerged from the watery Apsu, the abyss, with these gifts of civilization, and then banished there by the chief god. Again, a scholar by the name of Amar Anus wrote a paper about this about 2010, and it was brilliant. He's also the one who connected the Greek understanding of their heroes, the demigods like Theseus and Heracles and Perseus, to the Rephaim, by showing that the Greek term for the men of the golden age, Meropes, anthropoi, of course, anthropology, that's the men part. But the Meropes, that word actually comes from the same Semitic root behind Rephaim.
Wow.
So
that's fascinating. Explain to people what the Rephaim are.
Well, Rephaim is just a different term for the Nephilim, the giants of Genesis chapter 6. By the time of Moses, they were called Rephaim, which a couple of scholars have argued is a term derived from Akkadian, the Akkadian word Rabbaum, meaning to be great or large. In other words, Rabbaum meaning the great ones or the mighty ones.
Now, I thought there's an association with death, that the Rephaim, that there's an association with that they were great ones, but they were like dead great ones.
Well, that's the thing. When Abraham was in the land, and you had the kings from the east in Genesis 15, Chedorlaomer and his coalition coming from Mesopotamia to do battle with the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and their allies, they had to fight Rephaim tribes along the King's Highway in the Transjordan, the areas later Bashan, Ammon, Moab, and Edom.
Right.
They did battle with these giant tribes. By the time of Moses, 400 years later, Og of Bashan was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. And we know from these texts at Ugarit, again, this Amorite kingdom in northern Syria, that they were considered underworld beings. Because there are texts from Ugarit from about the time of the judges that literally summon the Rephaim from the netherworld to.
That's my reference that I'm thinking. Yes.
Yeah. The Rephaim texts summon them to a ritual meal at the sanctuary or the threshing floor. Interestingly, Sharon did some really excellent stuff on threshing floors as portals in the book Giants, Gods, and Dragons, and also the previous book Veneration, especially. They were summoned to this ritual meal to be where they would be revivified by the name of El, the Canaanite creator god, and the name being the concept similar to the name in the Old Testament, where the name, capital N name, is an aspect of Yahweh, an aspect of God. Follow the angel because my name is in him.
Yes.
Well, these Rephaim were summoned to Mount Hermon to be revivified or resurrected by El. And the texts literally say they mount their chariots. They travel first one day and then another. And at dawn of the third day, they arrive. Like, if you're a Christian and you don't recognize the significance of that.
The third day.
The third dawn of the third day. Gee, where have you heard that before? Like every one of the four gospels.
Right.
So, yeah, Jesus.
Famous imitator. There is a famous imitator there.
Yes, Jesus reversed that ritual.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fabulous. That's great. Another great catch for the Gilberts. I have one more mountain I want to talk about, and then the rest I want to talk about. And I can tell we're going to have to come back and do this again in a few weeks because I want to get to the seals, but we're not going to get to the seals today. Just there's too much else to talk about. But I want to talk about one more mountain, and we'll kind of finish up with that. Let's talk about Eden, the holy mountain.
Okay.
And because I have a different view than you do, and I want to introduce you to it because you may not have read that chapter in Rebooting the Bible Part 2. I'm not sure. But anyway, you say Eden was a holy mountain. And this is Ezekiel 28, and the divine council met there, which of course I believe that's very much a Mike Heiserism. It was the seat of the gods on the mountain of God, and Adam and Eve were there, and they served alongside the elder brothers. That sounds like Timothy Abarino.
Yes.
Or Elohim as members of the we're in the same crowd, I know. Or Elohim as members of the Lord's divine council. I guess the question, I had Adam and Eve and being part of the divine council. To me, that's like, well, maybe you went just a little further than Heiser had gone, suggesting that Adam and Eve were in the divine council, even though they were innocent and not yet fully, inaugurated into the divine because they haven't been through their test, I guess, which we've all been part of. But talk about that if you would.
Well, this is interesting because last year we were guests at Jamie Walden's Warrior Retreat, along with Tim Alberino. And we were talking to him about this book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons. And he was telling us about his book, Birthright.
Right.
And we found that we were tracking along the same lines. And even to the point of using, the phrase elder brothers to refer to the angelic realm.
Great minds think alike, Derek.
And we found that not only did we agree on that, but we also had spotted something in one of the parables of Jesus that led us to conclude that Adam and Eve were originally part of this divine council.
Okay. I'm all ears.
And if you talk to Tim about this or read his book, I think you'll know where I'm going here. And
I've only read the first half. I've only read the first half. Okay, go ahead.
This is the parable of the prodigal son.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
When we are the prodigal children. We were created as younger brothers and sisters of the spirit realm, the angelic realm,
Right.
and we were given our inheritance, which essentially was planet Earth.
Okay.
We were given dominion over this creation of God and told that we were to be stewards of it. We are God's imagers, His image bearers on this earth. That's another Heiserism.
Another Heiserism,
Yeah,
which I love, by the way.
but we squandered it. We squandered our inheritance, and Tim even took this a step further because I didn't see this connection. The your viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with the story. The younger brother goes out and squanders his inheritance. He gambles it away. He's profligate with his spending. He spends it on drink and loose women and gambling, and he's reduced to, in desperation, hiring himself out as a servant to a swineherd. And he says, well, the swineherd, of course, that's Satan. Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
because yes, and then
Part of the
and then
swine.
yeah, because the swine, of course, the pig in the
Yeah.
ancient world to Jew, well, to this day is an unclean animal, and so you couldn't get any lower
Yeah.
in the Jewish mind than selling yourself out to raising this unclean animal.
Yeah.
But we took it a step further and pointed out that according to the research we found from scholars who've read the original text from the Hittites and the Hurrians and the Jews and all the cultures in the ancient Near East, it appears that the only reason, or the main reason, if not the only reason, for raising swine at all in the ancient world was to offer them as sacrifices to the dead.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Because
Okay.
pork was unclean in most of the cultures of the ancient Near East.
Mm-hmm.
But because of their chthonic connection, meaning their underworld connection, because they're always rooting in the dirt, apparently,
Yeah. Yeah.
they were considered an acceptable sacrifice to offer to the dead, which may be why God said that is forbidden. Yes, I know the argument is trichinosis, and well,
Right.
no, if you cook it right, that's not an issue.
Yeah.
It was the ritual aspect
Yes.
of the meat that was forbidden. That's why. I mean, that's why the Gerasene demoniac was amongst the herd of pigs amongst the tombs. They were there where they were going to be slaughtered and offered up as sacrifices to the spirits of the ancestors, which we've learned over our last 3 years of research was central to the religion of the pagans around ancient Israel. So that's how low the younger brother, this prodigal son, had gotten. He was sold himself out to the one who raised these unclean animals that were offered to the spirits of the dead, who in fact were demons. And the demons are just the spirits of the Rephaim, the Nephilim, destroyed in the flood. That's who we are in this story. And yet, in desperation, we return to the Father. And instead of, maybe I can work for his servants. And Tim, by the way, asks a brilliant question. Who are the servants? They're not members of this household. Does this imply there are other sentient, intelligent species in the universe and God's creation? Don't know. That's irrelevant.
Right.
Fascinating.
Could be taking the analogy one step too far, but go ahead.
Could be, but
Yep.
still interesting speculation.
Yeah.
But the point is, by returning to the Father would have every right. In fact, the Son appears to expect the Father to just say, "You are no longer worthy to be called my son. Yes, you can work you get to muck out the stables or whatever." And that would have been an improvement over his lot.
Yes,
And yet
definitely.
instead, the Father runs out, puts the cloak on him, puts the ring of inheritance back on his finger,
Yeah.
and orders the servants to kill the fatted calf and prepare a banquet to celebrate the return of the son. And the older brother, the angels,
Yeah.
who've been faithful, saying, "Hey, wait a minute. We've been here all along. I've been here the whole time." What? And the Father says, "You've got your inheritance. Rejoice, for this one is returned home." That is a picture of this whole war from the beginning of creation until now. And that's what lies ahead in the future. We're still on that path, returning back to the Father, but a day is coming. And we see this in Hebrews chapter 2, where the first 2 chapters of Hebrews really is about why God created the angels and created us, and why Christ needed to become one of us to bring us back to that position amongst the divine council. And when he gets to Hebrews, this chokes me up every time I read it. For he who sanctifies, Hebrews 2, verse 11, he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That's God, of course. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. He's talking about us, brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
He, Christ, is telling of God to us and calling us his brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise.
Wow.
And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me.
Wow.
This is a picture of Christ
it's so
reintroducing us
yeah.
to the divine council.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, I could go on, but that is such a fabulous way to sum up our discussion for today. We just have to stop there. You can't beat what you just said. That's tremendous.
Well,
so wow, great.
It's the word of God. You can't improve on that.
Yeah, well, that's why the Lord does like us, though, to kind of embellish and kind of put things in context so that we all get goosebumps, right? So
yeah, that one does. I delivered that once at a conference and I broke down weeping. Yeah,
it's fabulous. I hear you. When I talk about the martyrdom of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I can hardly contain myself in that. So, well, Derek, you have established yourself as an incredible scholar. You've really, you've probably, like me, studied the Bible a lot through the years, but in the last 5 or 6, maybe 7 years, your growth is just fabulous, and it's so evident. And I like to think that I have a pretty good memory for names and so forth, but you've really outdone me. That's tremendous amount of awareness and knowledge you have of these ancient gods and pantheons, the scholars, etc. What a fabulous gift to give me and my audience, and I appreciate it so much. And bless you, bless Sharon. I would hope that we could have you come back in a few weeks, and we'll just start right with the seals of Revelation.
Oh,
and then I should have more of my research done and what I want to talk about, and hopefully we'll have a fabulous discussion there because it's tremendous. So the book is Giants, Gods, and Dragons: Exposing the Fallen Realm and the Plot to Ignite the Final War of the Ages, by Sharon Gilbert and Derek Gilbert, and it's a terrific book. If you're like me, you won't agree with everything, but you'll agree with about 99% of it. And you'll find it just tremendously elucidating, and the history and the additional, what I would call, amplification of the scripture is not to be missed. So anyway, so Derek, thank you so much. Tell Sharon we appreciate her work on the book too.
Oh, absolutely. All the good parts came from her. So I'll definitely pass that along. But always enjoy our conversations, Doug. It's always fascinating talking with you.
Tremendous. And yes, and of course, you're my favorite interviewer, as I say, and now you're my favorite TV talk show host. Well, news host. We'll give you an anchor, So anyway, so it's fantastic. All right. Well, I'll let you go. We'll talk again in a few weeks, and blessings, and the Lord be with you and Sharon and Skywatch TV.
All right. Thank you, brother.
All right. Bye-bye.